Hey, welcome back to Garbardia. It's good to have you here again. Good to have you listening in on today's chapter of the Veil Riders, chapter 14. And real quick, before we start out with the chapter, I want to say I appreciate all of you who are donating to the coffee. You're really helping me out this month due to shenanigans going on right now. But I do appreciate it. There's also only, I believe, 15 patches left or something like that. Once I run out, if folks still need some, I will do a second order of them, so just let me know down below in the comments. But here we go. Chapter 14. If there ever was a hell on earth, Yule doubted it could be any worse than how he felt right now. Usually, after the hero of the story was Deus Machina'd from certain death, they would be right as rain and able to easily take care of whatever needed taken care of. Yule was beginning to think that Nordic-looking death tart had forgotten to cure him of his wounds, or didn't do so just to spite him. For the next week after leaving the ruins of the village that once was, Yule was in constant, searing pain all over his body. His spine felt like it was made out of rocks and marbles. His knees clicked and cracked after he got up from sleeping. His face was still a partially ruined mess, and he still had a slight wheeze when he breathed. The health potion, as much of it that there was in the living bandages he sucked dry, merely managed to stabilize him and keep him from dying. It, however, did nothing for his outward appearance, and after looking down into a shallow pond, Yule saw that he looked like a ghost stepping out from a Vietnam jungle. It was by luck that he was even managing to feed and water himself, stumbling upon streams that held water he could drop salt tablets into, and fish that were just a tad too slow to avoid his hungry hands. He still lacked a lot of gear he needed for a comfortable outdoor stay, only able to scrounge up scraps of things from his dead troopers, and only a single vial of Yethus' precious blood survived his rucksack getting thrown through a wall, with Yule attached to it. A lot of supplies in his own pack didn't survive the impromptu interior redesigning of the cottage. His cell phone smashed, various bottles of liquids broken, and his shelter half was more like shelter tatters at this point. All of his maps were on his phone, having left the physical copies at Valhalla Hill, which meant that Yule was dead reckoning himself in the general direction towards him alone, and using the rumble of artillery to fine-tune. The one thing that kept Yule going was the ever-simmering anger inside of him, along with the frustration of constantly being in pain and out of touch with his mangled platoons. The artillery truly had destroyed any kind of radio or communication device, and not even the rare walkie-talkies managed to survive the shelling. Yule had to assume that Mullen was following his orders and taking the surviving auxiliaries back to base, or the survivors themselves would understand the situation and head back themselves. This in turn meant that, to Yule, he was entirely on his own, and at this point he was fine with that. If these Veil gods wanted to screw around with his well-deserved mortality, then Yule was going to fuck around and find out just how much patience they really had. The going was, however, slow, as Yule was in no shape to just sprint to him alone and start roundhouse kicking anything with pointed ears that he came across. This far back behind enemy lines, there was a sharp decline in enemy patrols, allowing him to make his way along the tree line with more freedom than he had in the past weeks. The silence that constantly whispered around him was uneasing. It was like not even the birds of this place felt like singing, or the bugs to chirr and click. Every once in a while, Yule would come across some lonely home or a group of houses tucked away near the forest in little clearings. They were always empty and devoid of any life, some looking like they were ruffled and rampaged by either someone leaving in a hurry or someone looking for something valuable. To Yule's annoyance, this usually meant that the larders were picked clean and nothing of real use to him was available. But every once in a while he would get lucky and find some wool blankets, old jars of food, and even a knife or two if he was really rolling hot on the dice. The rain came in consistent sneezing of showers, allowing the small creeks and rivers that ran around the place to be nice and full of moving water. which at least gave Yule some solace that hydration could be one less worry on his mind. Mile by mile, he drew closer and closer to him alone, the rumble of artillery turning into audible reports the nearer he got. Until one morning he popped out the dense foliage to spy the distant tall buildings and homes that clustered around some kind of earthworks. Yule's battered body was smarting quite raucously at this point, and half of his boot falls felt like he was wearing sacks of glass and angry crabs around his feet. He found a nice shady tree and sat down heavily, staring out into the distant city. Normally, he would be down in the grass and staying out of sight, but he was just too tired to care if the enemy saw him or not. He did not, funnily enough, have any desire to walk out to the city in broad daylight, and came to the conclusion he would wait until nightfall before he made his approach. As he sat against a tree, he pulled his dirty, shredded patrol cap low on his face to block out the low sun, and popped the top on a jar of some berry jam he found in a house along the way here. He was thankful he had stumbled upon his old hat when he was foraging for gear, as he had worn it for years and was an old anniversary present his past wife had gotten for him. Thoughts of his deceased wife hit Yule like a sucker punch to the chest, and he felt his heart do a little squeeze as he pulled an old metal spoon from his ruck. Yule sat there in the grass, rubbing his thumb idly up and down the jar, staring down into the tall strands in between his legs. "Would have finally gotten to say I'm sorry," Yule murmured, his mouth giving a slight twitch, before he shook his head and poked a spoon into the jar of jam. Another thought caressed its way into his mind, and he thought of Olivara back at Norris. Even as the sweet and tart berry confection coursed over his tongue, he sighed and closed his eyes, leaning forward slightly off the tree. Olivara, he thought, and his mind conjured back the images of her face, her eyes, her smile, the way her hands had felt on his skin, the way the sun had sparkled within the sweat on her soft flesh. Yule opened his eyes slightly and a small, sad smile played on his lips. Well, maybe not dying wasn't all that unfair. He popped his spoon back into the jar and lifted out another mound of the stuff, plopping it into his mouth. Olivara was one of the few things that actually made him feel weightless and happy nowadays, and he wiggled his ripped boots back and forth as he thought more and more of her. He cared for his little harpy friends and felt some levels of affection for Yethus, but Olivara was just so real with him, and always seemed to know what he wanted or what he needed. He had never felt such a connection in a long time, and even now, the thoughts of her slowly drained the anger from his heart, and his feet seemed to hurt just a little less. The cheerful thoughts of Olivara's body in the shape of her slowly gave way to another nagging thought that he had been suppressing for the long walk here. The other elves. There was still that captured half-fae at Valhalla Hill, and he was about to dive into a stronghold of them here in just a few hours. The week before, he had thought of them as just another enemy he had to contend with in order to get to the Vale. But they had been shelled into pieces just like his platoons. He had been there after all, searching the ruins for anything useful, and had seen their bodies strewn about the ground and in the rubble of the destroyed buildings. They had fought so eagerly and even proudly, but were they okay with being shelled like that? Not even their command building had been spared, the large radios and their operators scattered along the stones. Yule's teeth clinked quietly as he tapped them on the spoon in thought, thinking back to the artillery strike. If he remembered right, they seemed as surprised as he was. He even remembered seeing some of the chosen children soldiers running away from the blast, or screaming in terror as they were thrown through the air. If they were in on the extreme broken arrow type shelling, why would they have ran? Why would they seem afraid? There was no doubt they had some kind of intelligence agencies on their side at this point, spies running around and doing their spy things. They would know that Yule didn't have anything more than dwarven mortars. While Yule would have preferred to think more about Olivara getting dressed, he knew he had to mull long and hard over what he was going to do once he got inside him alone. He had little doubt that he could probably kill every last fucking elf inside that city if he had a mind to, and he had slaughtered so many as it was. But did they deserve it at this point? Were they even aware of what was going on outside of their own bubbles of communication? Remembering what the half-fae had done to her fellow survivors, he had an inkling that there was more to the story of the chosen children than what he had assumed. After all, there have been so many twists and turns to the tale of the Vale that Yule wasn't even sure who was enemy and who was friend at this point. Shoot, he had beaten Brita black and blue at one time, and now the two breakfasted together. He had ambushed a convoy of European soldiers, only to have a whole litter of them running around his company after getting gunned down by their own would-be elven allies. Yule groaned and dug a spoon back down into the jar, his shoulder blade clicking with the movement. What a fucking headache. The Fae were definitely playing a lot of games at once, and abusing their play pieces in order to get to their end goal. On the surface, that goal seemed to be take over the world. The signs all pretty much pointed to that, and it was obvious. And therein lies the issue, Yule mused, as he rummaged around for a canteen. It was obvious, very obvious. But where had obvious things gotten him so far? How many times had he been proven wrong by following the obvious trains of thought, leaping to the obvious conclusions? With a sad thought, Yule unscrewed the top of his canteen and swigged a few mouthfuls of water, some of it trickling down the side of his mouth and twisting into his beard. His wife had been good at this kind of thinking, being able to play 4D chess with the best of them, and she would doubtlessly be screeching the answer to him from wherever she was resting as a spirit. Olivara would probably know too. She always seems to know what others don't. Yule chuckled a bit, another reason why he wished Olivara was here, and screwed the cap back onto his canteen. He rested his eyes on the faraway buildings and pulled his legs close to him, wrapping his arms around his knees. The tree wasn't all that comfortable, but he leaned against it all the same, his muscles throbbing from the innumerable injuries they still bore. Yule sat and waited for the sun to go down, listening to the wind rustle through the tops of the trees, the distant sounds of the city, and the deep, throaty rumble of the artillery. When the night came and everyone in Emmalone began their complacent nightly rituals, they moved about unaware of the reckoning that was walking amongst them. After listening to the two sentries talk for a few minutes, Yule had come to the conclusion that they were no future allies of his. He had low-crawled all the way up to the small clearing in order to not glow in the partial moonlight, and achieved getting not only around them, but behind them. Yule did his best to give them a fair shake, something he was trying to do more now since he had given it a long thought before he crawled down here, but they seemed to have no love for his lads and ladies at Valhalla Hill. One of the sentries was a taller female chosen, while the other was a slightly shorter male. The two were in full battle rattle and stayed standing the entire time as they spoke, looking out into the clearing before them. They didn't move much either, preferring to just stand in their little knee-deep hole. It was not going to be an easy kill, doubly so from the state of Yule's body, but he was going to have to do what he could in order to secure these mooks' weapons. They were also pretty isolated, almost as if they were a picket, and were the only real chance he had that didn't involve more elves being aware of the attack. Yule crawled up until he was only 10 feet away from the female, and silently pulled the knife from his boot. I've seen some of the things they're pulling out of the Queen's doorway, something named Bradley, the female said, scuffing the heel of her boot on the ground. The male elf fussed with the chin strap of his helmet, the lip of which getting thrown down over his eyes as he fingered the fasteners. Oh yeah, the little angry boxes that look like they have a tiny ogre head on top. Alwyn said they will allow us to just dismantle whatever this Valhalla Hill is. With that barbarian leader of theirs supposedly dead, they could be relatively easy to push north. He finished fussing with his chin strap and righted his helmet, looking over for the female elf's reply. As his eyes came into focus, they widened as he took in what was lurching behind her back. The female elf had barely opened her mouth when the dagger punched straight into her neck, Yule's momentum carrying it forward and shredding the entire length of flesh right to her collarbone. The blood sprayed into the air and droplets of crimson splashed across the male's face. She gurgled, both of her hands clamping down onto her neck as she fell down to her knees. But Yule didn't even stop moving. Before the male elf even had time to register what was going on and fully lift his rifle, Yule's boot tip thumped muffledly into his groin, and all the air left the male elf's lungs. The kick was so violent that both of the elf's boot heels left the ground, and when he came back down, he came down hard onto his stomach, vomit splashing out onto the ground beside his face. Yule spared no time for either of them to suffer, dispatching both with 2 swift stabs to their armpits. Yule flicked his fingers a few times to rid them of the rivulets of blood, then leaned down to brush his hands against the uniform of the male elf, getting most of the blood off of his flesh. The male elf's eyes were locked onto his, and Yule stared back down at him, his vomit-covered lips twitching as if trying to make words. Yule didn't see anger or resentment in his eyes, only fear. The fear of death, the fear of dying, of knowing it is the end, and no one was going to be nearby to help. Yule frowned and bent lower to the elf, resting on a single aching knee. "It's nothing personal, bud. I'm sorry," Yule whispered, and noticed how uncomfortable it was to kill with a conscience now. While the female elf died quickly, the male seemed to cling on to life for as long as he could, clawing at the last precious seconds of dwindling consciousness. With monumental effort, the elf dragged his hand up and held it up slightly at the wrist, the palm exposed, the fingers shaking with the blood loss. Yule looked down at the hand and knew what the elf wanted, as he had seen the exact same gesture countless times over his life, not only on Earth, but here on this side of the veil as well. Yule reached down and took the hand in his, and he felt the feeble fingers of the dying elf squeeze with as much strength as they could muster. Holding the trembling hand, Yule patiently waited until it no longer shook, and until the elven eyes no longer focused on him, but stared silently into nothing. Yule gave the hand a little wiggle inside, hanging his head with a slight shake and speaking in a hushed, pained tone. "Yeah, that was uncomfortable." He placed a hand down near the dead elf, kind of tucking it in close to the body so it looked like he was just sleeping on his stomach with his legs curled, and turned around to look at the female. Unlike her male compatriot, she had died visibly outraged, and even her death mask bore a snarl of indignation. Yule didn't feel nearly as bad about killing her, but still arranged her in a less sprawled configuration. Being nice to them just felt weird to Yule, but he did it to at least try and humanize his thoughts about them before he entered the city. Thankfully, they were out here in full kit, and Yule scooped up a blood-covered M4, tucking the rest of the full magazines into his own empty holders. He didn't dare take much else, needing to stay as quiet as possible, and didn't want to rattle too much with a bunch of looted stuff he didn't need. The most important thing he found was that the female elf had a set of head-strapped night vision goggles tucked into her dump pouch, and Yule wasted no time strapping them onto his sore face. As Yule moved through the tall grass by the side of the road leading into town, he was angry for a whole new reason. For the first time in a while, he felt bad about a kill. While Yule had done some rather regrettable things, issued some commands that people got hurt over, he never really felt bad about it. Sometimes soldiers kill, sometimes soldiers die, but it's usually under a certain set of rules and understandings between combatants. There's a clear conviction between the two parties that made war, but the Fae had perverted the whole sacred process. Why did that male elf die? Did he even know? Why did they shell their own people to pieces just to take out a small company of Veil Riders of all things? Killing the elves would have never even been a blip on his radar a few weeks ago, but everything was wrong now. He died in combat, yet here he was, another kink in the process, another fouling of the tradition. The Fae were perverting the rules of combat further by abusing the soldiers under their command more than any Terran ever had. Even the most bloodthirsty of the Terrans still held themselves to rules, commandments given down from the first steps of man by the gods of war. Yule rounded a small fence and saw a light ahead, taking an alleyway that held no light within it. He could hear elves walking and talking all around him, and he carefully laid every step to avoid detection. Whenever he could, he kept to the shadows and plowed on where the light did not touch, keeping his night vision on and only flipping them up to see where the elves were walking. He knelt down near a pile of supply crates and poked the barest sliver of his face around the wood, watching the elves that were hanging around outside of a tavern, someplace called the Drooling Pony. As Yule watched them, his skin became hotter, and the coals of anger stoking themselves back to life. This whole thing was a dumpster fire. The elf should never have died because Yule shouldn't even be alive. These southern elves shouldn't have rifles or be caught up in this war, and only were because they were being spun like a top by these fucking Fae that seemed to be pulling all the strings. The elf didn't die a hardened soldier with convictions, he died as a scared pawn of something bigger than the both of them. If Yule got his way, he was going to set every race free of their grasp on this plane, and die trying. Or die again trying. He wasn't sure of how dying worked here, which was aggravating. A bundle of elves spilled out of the tavern, and the words coming from what looked like an officer were loud and heated. Yule pressed his patrol cap back down tightly onto his head, but nothing came to him from what he could hear. Must be too far away, Yule thought. And he slid back into the shadows, walking across the rear gardens of multiple townhouses as he stalked the group. The officer had what looked like a younger female southern elf by the scruff of her uniform top, while two other elves walked beside him, rifles slung and held lazily by one hand across their chests. The little cluster was moving towards a darker and quieter part of the city, away from the artillery much to Yule's annoyance, but he kept shadowing them nonetheless. When some stray elves that were smoking near a few homes inquired about what was going on, they were ignored, and the officer dragged the female onward. It was quite dark here now, such to the point that the two elves walking with the officer pulled out their flashlights to light the way, and Yule had a growing bad feeling about the whole thing. As they closed in distance, Yule's amulet began to pick up some of the words being spoken, but nothing really made sense to him for what he could tell. Despite the throbbing of his back and knees, Yule managed to keep pace with them, despite having to hurdle lone stone walls or duck down low to avoid being spotted out of someone's window. After another 200 meters of winding and random turns in the road, Yule began to smell a pungent odor and wrinkled his nose. They had dragged the elf all the way to what seemed like the trash heap of the city, and Yule could see a few small bobcats here and there that must be the machines for piling or carrying away buckets of the stuff. Yule then spied a single pole in the middle of it all with ropes around it, and he almost rolled his eyes from how cartoonishly evil the whole setup was. They're going to kill her at a dump? Yule pondered, and began trying to work an angle on the flanks of the small group. It took some doing, and a small cat seemed to take a liking to him, chasing after the loose straps on his rucksack. But Yule did manage to get a hard angle on the whole scene, only 10 meters away. They had strode forward and tied the elf to the pole, who was now yelling at the officer while the other two elves worked the knots around her wrist. "She was my sister, Aerolith. I heard her over the radio. They never asked for artillery to be that close. I heard her call out the coordinates," she bellowed, and Yule could hear her choking with the rage that stung at her eyes. The officer, who Yule assumed to be Aerolith, shook his head from side to side, but Yule couldn't see his face yet, only hearing his voice. "You just had to pull the cable and send the rounds, Fino. Your sister was killed by the Veil Rat." Aerolith was cut short by Fino, who lurched forward against her bindings, roaring at him fiercely. "Yule? The fucking monkeys? No, Aerolith, we killed her, and you've been lying to us all this entire time." Under the illumination of the night vision, Yule could see her snarling at this Aerolith character, and the two other elves finished their rope tying. Everyone else is smart enough to know their place, started Aerolith, turning to walk away from Phino. And yours shall be here in this dump because you kept poking your nose where it shouldn't be. Yule stiffened, and not because the small cat was biting his calf while mewling happily. As Aerolith turned, the night vision goggles brought the elf's eyes into focus, and they glowed bright, just as Coco had said in his report so long ago. Fey, Yule growled, and he set the rifle on the ground, reaching down to pull out the boot knife from its sheath. The elves walked a few paces away and turned back around to face Phino, whose face was now wet with angry tears. Yule stepped out from the corner of the house he was hiding near, his night vision humming on his forehead. Phino was staring straight ahead at Aerolith and the other elves as the trio cocked back the bolts on their rifles. On the bright side, you'll get to see your sister again here soon. Call it what do the humans call it? A Pyrrhic victory. Aerolith gave a short laugh as he brought up his rifle and placed his red dot on Phino's chest. Phino glared at him through the lens of the optic, but then her eyes darted to the left. Aerolith watched as she raised her head and twisted her eyes slightly, squinting as if trying to see something. Then her eyes went wide as Yule stepped into the faint overglow of their flashlights, as if he were a many-eyed monster that materialized out of the shadow itself, holding the still bloody blade in his hand. Gods above, she rasped, and shrunk back against a pole, her eyes following Yule as he came within feet of Aerolith, his hands raised and poised for the strike. If Aerolith had something clever or snarky to say to Phino, he never got the chance to say it after the boot knife came around and punched right up under his chin, spiking the blade deep into the bottom of his brain. It was instant lights out for the officer, his legs going dead to the world as soon as his brain was punctured, and the body ragdolled to the ground in a clumsy heap. The elf next to Aerolith turned, startled, and brought the barrel of his M4 up. Yule simply helped it along, slapping the barrel up in time with his jerking arm and smashing the barrel of it into his face. It was enough of an opening for Yule to sink one of the looted kitchen knives into the eye socket of the elf and jerk the rifle out of his now curled hands. His fellow was just as shocked to see both his commander and his comrade go from breathing to dead in such a short manner of time, and actually turned to run after a few moments of hesitation. Those wasted seconds cost him dearly, as Yule leapt forward and grabbed the elf in a naked choke, dragging them both to the ground in the darkness. The beams of flashlights spun and caught the puffs of dust from the road, scrabbling feet kicking up small clouds from the ground as the two beings wrestled. Phino could only see flashes of movement, a boot here, a hand reaching out there, but the fight was fought in the darkness of the night. Phino heard grunting and gurgling from the darkness, until she then heard nothing at all for a time. Her chest heaved as she strained her eyes to pierce the gloom, trying to desperately see what was going on behind the glow of the flashlights. Her high southern elf ears heard something stand up, the crunch of gravel under boots, and the flashlights went out one by one, until there was nothing in front of her, the moon not strong enough to light her way. The boot falls came towards her, and she leaned back against a pole, staring out at the looming shadow that came towards her. She could smell Yule, the stank of sweat, blood, and old wounds, of old worn clothes and unwashed skin. Her heart pounded painfully in her chest as the thing stood before her, and she winced from both the smell of him and the fear of the knife that would soon be coming down onto her neck or skull. She had read the reports of how these humans took out their prey in close combat. She just hoped this one knew how to do it quickly. Phino closed her eyes and waited, panting in and out of her nose harshly, but the blow never came. Just the low, measured breathing of the thing in front of her. They started the artillery from your end of the village. Phino jerked her head up, her heart still thumping in her ears. What? She felt the thing lean past her, its beard rubbing against her shoulder as it cut away her bindings. When we attacked, they started the artillery from deep within your end of the village and walked it towards us. The entire Chosen Children company was decimated along with my platoons. Fino didn't know her blood could run any colder than it already was, but she was finding many things were possible tonight. She felt Yule's night vision come down around her head and come across her eyes, and she now stared into the eyes of the man she had seen in so many reports. The facial scar was new, but it was definitely him. It was definitely Yule. You're Yule, she whispered in shock, and he smiled at her with a toothy grin, the blood of her officer still speckled on his cheek. I am, and I am sorry for your sister. She fought fiercely and died a warrior. There was a small pause before Fino whispered, "Thank you." Fino saw Yule nod before standing up and popping his wrist. He looked down at her, his eyes dark with thought, before he held out his hand to her. "What are your feelings on revenge, Fino?" And that's the end of chapter 14. I hope you all enjoyed. If you like the story and others like them, be sure to like and subscribe to Garbeardia. And also stop by Neckbeardia for more D&D story green texty goodness. Also coming up this week will be a new story for you guys. I hope you guys enjoy it. Hope you guys enjoy it. Hope you guys enjoy it. It's a different take on the fantasy genre with a bit of fucking Cthulhu stuff tossed in. Could be fun. And I hope you guys enjoyed the new narrator. Her audition went pretty well, and I hope you guys enjoy her readings as much as I did. But until I see you next time on this side of the veil, this has been Guardbro.
All those moments will be lost in time.